So the next thing we want to do is make this kind of information panel here with all the loudnesses on. So you'll notice one thing on here so far that's different. All of these components are actual buttons or completely customized one-off grids. Whereas what we have now is a kind of repeating UI. So we have this kind of large text, small description, large text, small description repeated over and over. Even these buttons are kind of the same thing, large text, small description. So this is the perfect time to take a look at some templated controls. So if we look at Avalonia and in authoring controls, this is where we want to make our own control style. We've got a few options. We've got user controls, which mention this is the best way to make views or pages. And user controls are limited to one kind of control. So it's not really restylable or reusable as much. Templated controls, on the other hand, are what they call lookless controls. So they are basically a control that's defined by a class that has nothing but properties on. And you then add a style, which you include using the style include reference, like this, to include the actual XAML that matches your class to style the control. That means you can also make multiple UIs for the same control. So, for example, this button having large text, small text, and this button having large text, small text can be the same templated control, and we just override the visual template between the two. There doesn't seem to be any documentation on how to use the templated controls, though, so we are going to take a look at that ourselves and basically figure that out based on WPF knowledge. So we'll start with the details grid. We'll just get rid of this and remember that it's column 1 and width 170. I'm just going to chuck a stack panel in for now, I reckon will do. And then it wants to be in grid.column1 and the width 170. And now inside of here, we want our custom control. If we right click and we want to add to the project, add, we've got Avalonia templated control. We're going to call this large label control, I guess. That name will do for now. And you can see what we'll have here is we'll have the XAML and we'll have a code behind. The code behind is just a single class with a name and it implements templated control, and that's it. That's all the class is. And this is why it's a lookless control. There is no visual, there's no elements to it so far. But then it makes this kind of parent XAML, which isn't really the parent of the C# class in a sense. It's just literally a style. So you can see it inherits the styles. This designer, if we pull up the designer, you can see you can preview the type of control here. You could also update this to have multiple controls inside. So you can then preview multiple controls. And this will come in handy when we have multiple templates for a control. So you can see what happens here is we have a style, like any other style, where the selector is every version of a large label control. And then what this style does is override the template of the actual control. And then inside there puts whatever we want inside of the control. So this is how we are going to control the visual of a templated control. So let's start by just designing our UI that wants to basically be one of these boxes. So it should be pretty straightforward. That's clearly just a stack panel with two labels in. And we'll do the label like this, content. And we'll do something like minus 31.2 LUFS. We'll do another label. And this could be short term. We want to get rid of the padding between the two. Actually, we will need a border for background because we'll want some background color going in here. And the background can be the color of this. And then we'll have a highlighted color. So instead of just typing in colors directly into templates now, let's go and just make some resources, some dynamic resources. So we do application.resources, Anything we put in here can be a static or dynamic resource. We want a solid color brush with a key of, we'll call this mid blue brush. And then here we'll have the value. And then while I'm at it, I'm just going to define all the other colors we've had in the application. So this light blue color, this dark blue color, and we'll do this salmon-y color here as well. And you can see the underlines are the actual colors that you mentioned. So this looks like an error, but this is actually the color of the salmon. And if you look closely, you can kind of see the underlying color here as well. So now we have these resources, and these are in the application. You can find these anywhere by just referencing the name. So the mid blue is this blue here. So we're going to use that in the background here. So to do that, we just simply do dynamic resource in this case. Dynamic resource and mid blue brush. And you can see there we now have the background. The labels want to have a foreground of white. But instead of doing defined colors inside of this template as well, meaning that we can't override them higher up, instead what we can do is just specify these will naturally inherit the template's colors anyway. We will set as part of the defaults here, just set the default foreground color. And that way, if the main window wants to override the color of the foreground, it can just set the color as you'd expect. So that's the best way to do it. Similar to this background, we don't want to bind it to this exact color. Instead, we want to bind that to the background of this template itself and set the default background color to that template for now, and then it can still be overridden. One thing the documentation mentions that you can overlook is if you're providing a style for a templated control, which if you don't, you won't see anything anyway. If you are, you need to do a style include in the application. Otherwise, we won't see anything. So before we forget to do that, because we probably will, this is the style, this large label control .xaml file. So if we go to the application now and in styles, we want to include that with a style include, and the source being / large label control .xaml. That will now include this style file throughout the application. So when we come to use it in main window, it will get found. Next up, we want the font size to be much larger for the large font. So for that, we'll do font size 25. Oh, not font family. Font size 25, say. Looks a little bit big. 22. 21 looks okay. The small one wants to be small as well. Slightly smaller. That should do. And we'll have horizontal alignment center for both of them. And for the border, we'll want a little bit of padding as well. That looks about right. Yeah, I'd say that looks about the size. Now let's try and consume this. Let's just build the application so that the templates all compile and we can use them in the visual. And now in the stack panel, all we need to do to use them is just add a namespace. And it's in the same namespace as we are. We'll just call this controls. And it will be Avalonia loudness meter. That's just literally the only namespace we have. You can see in here, the namespace is just Avalonia loudness meter. So that's all we put as the controls namespace. And then to find that control now, it should appear if we just type controls, : and you can see there, large label control. And there's the control appearing. Put a few of those in. And you can see they all appear. We want a little bit of padding to kind of pad out this area. So we'll chuck a margin on here. Something like that. Yep, that looks similar. While we're at it, let's just clean up some of the hard-coded colors. This E5, E5, E5 can become a mid-gray color. So we'll call this medium gray brush. and then we'll just bind it to dynamic resource medium grey brush. Quickly scroll down, see if there's others we can spot. We have this one here, 1A, which is this one, dark blue brush. So this can now be a dynamic resource dark blue brush. This button here as well. So this style we put on the stack panel for these buttons, these two here, we notice we've got them here as well. So we're just going to move that style out at the same time. So we just move the stack panel style out of stack panel because that's inside of the volume button area. So that's kind of inside this area, and we want to use the buttons in another area. So we just move that style up to the top window for now. It's easy enough. Paste it here, change the stack panel styles to window styles. And then, so it doesn't affect every button, we'll just add a class to it and just call it, small, for like a small button. And then we'll just have to go back down into the volume bar area here. And where we get to the buttons, here, we'll just have to add class small, so they take on the appearance again. And now we can use that style in the other part of our UI. This button color here, we could nick as well. So 7F, I don't think we've got yet. No, we haven't. So we have medium, light, and dark blue. And we want a kind of rich blue, I'd call this. Because it's like a vibrant light blue. Or we could call it bright blue. Doesn't really matter what you name them, it's your own reference for remembering. So now we have bright blue brush. We can do the same again. Add that there. On the hover of the button, we've got a 9.8 reference. That's not there, so we can do bright blue hover brush. So we know it ties in with that specific color. And we'll just copy this. And I think that'll do for cleaning up into resources. We can always keep coming back and cleaning up. So let's just jump back to where we were. Press F5, make sure this currently compiles, runs, and looks correct. Which I think it does. We've still got the buttons, we've got the hovers, we've got the backgrounds. That grey is gone now. It hasn't found that grey. So that is medium grey brush it can't find. Why can't it find that? I must have typed it wrong. Let's run that again. And there we go, we've got the grey back. Right, so we have the visual here. Now the next thing is, how do we send extra information into the view? So we don't want it to be this static 31. We want to change the text dynamically. So to do that, we want to use attached properties. And if we go to the authoring controls, then defining properties, you can see we have registering styled properties. Unless you have a good reason not to, you should define properties on your controller styled. Styled ensure that your properties will work correctly with styling system. This is very similar to WPF attached properties, pretty much identical. Just have a browse through. Read-only properties, attached properties direct, using on another class. So it looks like we have two options, direct properties or styled properties. In general, you should declare your properties as styled. However, direct properties have advantages. No additional objects, property getter standard, but cons or can't inherit from class, blah, blah. So to be honest, I'm just going to use what they recommend for now, which is just styled properties. So if we go back into the class of the large label control, in order to bind in this template here, we need to actually set some attached properties. So an attached property is, for example, width on a stack panel, margin on a stack panel. These are all attached properties. The grid.column is an attached property. So actually, yeah, they are defining. So they're defining properties that attach to the child elements as attached, and they're calling the regular properties just styled properties. So by definition, technically, this is just a styled property, and then when you attach it, and technically this grid.column comes from the parent's grid that we're inside of, this is classed as the attached property. So this has been attached from the parent. Otherwise, it's just called a styled property. So we're going to add styled properties to ours. So if we go into the class, and oh nice, it looks like it's got some boilerplate code. Let's press tab. Oh, that's nice. There you go. So it's actually made all the boilerplate crap for us. And now we just type the name. So we'll call this large text. Yeah, large text property. Tab. The type is string. I think that's it. Press enter. So now it's made for us all of the code instead of us handwriting it. It's made as a public property with a getter and a setter that invokes the get value, which if we take a look where that comes from, go to definition, you can see this comes from the Avalonia object, so it's baked in. And the set value is also baked in. And what that's doing is setting this special kind of styled property with values, which we don't have to worry about this. This is just simply how you define styled properties. So you do this per one, and you don't really need to know that much. You make a public property with the name that then calls the get and set value on the styled property. And the styled property is created using this Avalonia property.register, passing in the type of class that it's attached to and the type that we are wanting the property to be, in this case a string. And then you can see it's done like large text. That's the only thing I'm not actually fond of. The auto-generated code is just typed in. So if I just rename this attached property goes out of sync. So instead what I would do is remove large text and instead do name of and then large text. And the benefit of this now, this will convert this property to a string. But if we were to rename this to large text 2, for example, you can see the property updates and maintains the reference. So I'd do that instead of the complete boilerplate code. We'll make one more, styled property small text, and that's a string. We'll get rid of this and do a name of small text. And now we have a small and a large text property on our templated control. That's all we need now. So if we just jump back to the template, and instead of just putting the content in here, we can now do template binding, and we should see, there we go, large text. And then if we do the same for the small, template binding, small text. And you can see it's disappeared here. So if I just compile, you can see the text isn't there. And that's because now it's bound to this large text property, but there's no default value. So in the Avalonia property.register, we put a comma after the name of. You can see all the extra values we've got. So the next one is a default value. The next one, whether it inherits, then binding modes. But the one we're interested in is the default value, which is next. So from the default value, we can just paste in what we originally had. Or we can just put something like large text. And for the small one, we can do the same, put small text. Now, if we go to the template, probably have to compile, we should see that we get that value in. There we go. Then if we go back to the main window, you can see now it defaults with that default text. But what we will notice now, the thing we needed and the reason for doing all that, is for each control now, we can access the styled property. So there's large text, we can put hello, and you can see the UI updates. And then for small text, we can do small text. And you can see we can update all the text. So let's just go ahead and paste a load of these in. I'm going to include these three as well, because they are large text, small text, and just dump some random values in so that this looks similar to what we want. So you can see there's just a bunch of large label controls, and all I've had to do is change the large and small text to match. I've put a bit of a margin between the change in what we want to become two different styles. And I've also set the background color of the second one down to the light blue brush. And the reason that works is because in our template, we bound the border, which is this background here, to the template's actual background property, which is what gets overridden when we're setting the background here. So that's how we can control that. I'll just chuck the 2 extra buttons and just copy and paste these buttons over here. And all I've done is reused the small class from the style of buttons that used to be there, and now we can style these the same. And I've just set the background color of the cross to the faded red color we made. So we've got some buttons in there. So now we've got the control as we want it. I'm going to show you one more powerful thing with templated controls, and the main reason you'd use a templated control versus a user control. We can now reuse this principle of a control that simply has a definition of a large and a small text and restyle it to look like either of these or many more. So you'll see the large label control, as I mentioned. The actual class is nothing more than overriding a templated control with 2 properties on. And this style is just a style on its own that targets that control. And this style can live anywhere, it really doesn't matter. And the user can create multiple styles anywhere else in the application. Or even if this became a UI library, this could be overridden outside of the library. So all we have to do to restyle this control is simply copy the style, paste it in, and let's just make a different selector. So we could have on hover the entire design change visually. You can just do dot and do say button to make it when there is an instance of this control here, but on a class called button, we now use this visual. So if we just make another copy of this control, so you can see 2, and this time add a class button, you don't see anything change here. But if we go into the button here and change, I don't know, foreground to red, you'll see this one changes to red. So we have 2 completely independent styles. Let's just slap in a margin of 10 for now. And let's also make the background match the actual application's dark background. We just chuck a border in here. And in order to style the background color, the same as the application for the correct visual, thanks to our dynamic resources now, we can just do background equals dynamic resource, dark blue brush. And it's hard to see there, but say we had 100 margin, you can see we have this dark background here. So this is the visual now that will match how our application actually looks. So onto this new button style, all we need to do is tweak this template now to simply look like we want to, which is basically a label without a background, and move the background onto this label and corner radius the label. So it's simple enough. The background now doesn't want to be on the border. We want to simply get rid of that. And we want to put the background on this label instead. We probably want the padding on as well, which means we no longer need this border at all. The label has effectively become what that other border was. We've already defined padding here, so let's just remove that. And then we'll probably just put some margin on these, just a small margin so we can see the difference. There's one, there's another. And now we want to do corner radius. About 20 seems okay. Bit less padding on the button. I don't think that looks far off. We need a little bit of margin on the top. And I think that looks okay there. So now all we do is go back, let's just compile. And it's as simple as now, watch how easy this is to restyle the entire UI and decide by putting a class on this one called button. It's restyled the entire control with nothing more than placing a class on. So you can see how powerful that is. those 3 buttons now have the class. We want some margin below as well, I think. I just want a little bit of margin. So I reckon margin, bottom probably 5 as well. And that looks nice. And then I reckon that looks about the same. So if we spin this up now and take a look, you can see here's ours. Here's the Julian loudness meter. And you can see pretty much we're slightly shorter on there by a pixel maybe. These are slightly different, but it's very, very close and visually looks the same. And all this was done with a single templated control that was really easy to do. And by looking at the elements of the UI, without thinking too much about is it a different thing altogether. So instead of having 2 completely different controls here, when really it's the same thing, it's a large text and small text, if you kind of try and visualize the UI in that manner and look for similarities where they are not standard controls like buttons here, or text or completely unique UIs like this, but instead something that's repeatable, that's when you make your templated control. So for example, in here, if you wanted, say, this kind of label, text box, and button as a templated control with styled properties called label, text, and button action, or button text and button action or something, you could do that as a combined element and then just use a single control to add properties to, instead of redefining this kind of repeatable UI layout. So anywhere you see a sort of repeating UI that isn't really simple, and you could save time by making templated controls, that's what they're used for. And you can see just how powerful they are in terms of how easy that was to just copy a large label control and set a class to change the appearance. And the class itself is really small and really simple, as well as having this awesome visual here. And I know I keep saying this, but I just think it's so cool how Avalonia have this kind of UI setup, the tools that work with it, the previews that work, and making it just so easy to do. I mean, this templated control has 0 documentation anywhere. It just literally says you can use templated control. But luckily, I have WPF knowledge, and I can make assumptions on the similarities between how it would work. And it's very easy for me to do that and go, for example, the resources is identical to WPF. So I didn't even really have to look at how to do resources. I knew that they'd just be in the application's resources, give them a name and a key, and then look them up wherever you want to use them. Similarly, this kind of template control is, again, it's WPF basically. So if you want further details on how this kind of templating works, bar the fact that we know how this selector works already, we know the setter is then replacing the template, and we know the template is the visual of the control. If you're unsure of how that kind of works, though, I do have WPF tutorials on YouTube as well. And we've also now seen a little bit of binding. In fairness, we're just binding to the template's properties, but we have done actual binding to a styled property. And in order for this to work as binding, I'd expect to see this styled property implementing iNotify property change somewhere down the line. So if we keep tabbing in, I would have expected this somewhere to implement iProperty changed, and it doesn't. So it must be something slightly different than iNotify property changed. And if we see here, it's made an iObservable, so it can observe something when it's changed. So this will be the thing that gets hooked into by the UI to monitor for a styled property changing. So it's a similar thing. It's just going to have, obviously, something that you can subscribe to be an observer of something changing. And this is just part of the .NET Core. So it's got iObservable, and view models will have iNotify property change, which is a similar principle. You hook in and register for when things change. So that's how the style property, when we alter it inside of the main window here and type the value in here, when we type that, it boils down all the way to Avalonia property, fires the changed, and the UI that will be hooked into this, so this actual main window, will register for that event and then push the update to our control. All that's done for us, so we don't need to worry about that. But that's the kind of benefits you'll start seeing when we do the MVVM view model binding as well. You'll just be able to type like this and see your UI update, and you'll be able to just set the values in your code behind and not have to worry about the UI updating to match. So hopefully that's been a good overview of how to use a templated control, and considering there's no tutorials out there so far, I hope this is useful to quite a lot of you to see how powerful templated controls can be. And imagine just using the kind of template selector, instead of being a different class, could literally just be when you hover over the button, it could change completely in appearance. So you can do some really powerful things with that, as well as having multiple versions of a control and being able to preview those styles of control all in one window. So that's it for this one. I hope it was useful, and I'll catch you in the next.